Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age. A dialogue with representatives of a global, multi-stakeholder community.
And I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I have a dialogue with I4ADA Hudig. Anna, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Frits, for having me.
Yeah. Allow me to introduce I4ADA to our listeners and watchers. You are a PhD researcher in computer science and technology at the University of Cambridge. And today we're going to talk about your research into consumer Internet of Things. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, before we're going to talk about your research, maybe first question, could you give me an example of what type of IoT devices we are talking about?
Yeah, so we're looking at specifically consumer IoT. So with IoT, we refer to Internet of Things, which is, we define Internet of Things as devices that typically have sensors that can perceive information from the environment, are connected to the internet or via Bluetooth perhaps, or directly. And sometimes they have actuators so they can bring changes in the environment. So that's the Internet of Things. And we are looking specifically at devices that can be used, but can be bought by individuals and can be bought off the shelf. We've been looking into 11 different product categories. So smart security cameras, baby monitors, smart scales, but also wearables like fitness trackers, child smartwatches, all kind of video doorbells, all kind of different devices.
Okay, so what I'm hearing actually, we should realize IoT is everywhere, more and more. And so what is your research question? What are you trying to uncover?
Yes, so with this project, our initial research question was, our aim was to build an understanding of the data processing practices in IoT. So IoT is a lot, it's also hardware, but we're really looking at the data flows. So we were wondering, can we use technical and legal research methods to get an understanding of this of these data processing practices of the vendors in the Internet of Things. So it was very, very open, explorative research question. That's how we started. These methods, these technical and legal methods involve, technically, we've been monitoring the data flows from these Internet of Things devices. So we captured all the data traffic from the device to the servers where the data are like stored or processed or whatever. And after we did that, we used our data rights. So in the UK and in the EU, we all have certain rights, such as the right of erasure or the right to be forgotten is well known, but we also have the right of access and the right to data portability. So individuals have the right to ask a company who's processing your data, to ask them like, what data do you have about me? What are you doing with this data? So the technical methods were the data flow monitoring, and the legal methods are sending these requests, data access requests, we call it. And then, the overarching research aim was, okay, what will we find when we're using these methods with regards to data processing? Okay,
so it's actually good to be aware that if you have an IoT device, like a monitor on your wrist to cover your health, whatever, it's not just sending you the data, it's actually being shared outside yourself as well. To what extent have you researched if people are aware that the data is being shared outside themselves?
That's a very good question. We didn't do that research yet, but that's really something I'm aiming to do. I got from just my personal conversations with people, I got an understanding that most people are not aware of that. Some people know they can download a copy of their data from Facebook and see what Facebook has about them. So this is more about the online world. But I think many people are not aware that we have these rights.
Let me now rephrase the question. What has your current research shown you of what the real data processes are that we should address this issue?
So it showed us, like what I said, like we were very optimistic. We're like, okay, we're going to use these data rights to get an understanding of what's going on in this domain. And then what we found was that the responses to the response rate to these data rights was very low among among companies in the consumer IoT. We got 43 different devices, and we asked all vendors that we could access that had an email address. We asked them, like, what data do you have about me? How are you using it? With whom are you sharing it? And none of the companies should reply within a month, and none of the companies answered completely to all of our questions within a period of a month's time. There were like 5 companies we couldn't approach. There were 5 companies that never responded. There were 4 more companies that said that did respond, but only delaying the process and never giving some substantial response. And then from the responses that we did receive, yeah, there were also a lot of problems. Many responses were way more generic than our questions were. Copies of personal data that we received were very, very limited. Most copies only involved perhaps like your account registration data, like your name and your email address, and some device specifications. So, for example, the MAC address or your IP address, or just a software version of the device. But like if you're using a security camera, for example, it's also collecting audio, it's collecting video data, it's, I don't know, maybe motion, maybe there are some activity logs in when it was activated. We did not receive a lot of information about that from companies.
Okay. Any conclusions you can already draw, or assumptions based on the fact that you got so little response? Because I can assume a variety of reasons why you're not getting that response.
Yeah, I think it depends on the company. So we had a diversity of companies. We had some very big tech companies, usually in the US. We had some very kind of anonymous companies selling cheap devices, usually from Asia. We had some European companies, like, yeah, we had some European companies that, and with some large tech companies, we saw that they kind of automated their process of data access. So they're saying like, okay, we're compliant, we have this portal, and here you can download a copy of our data. And the copies were generally very informative, and it was very helpful. But they were less likely to give a very personalized response to our requests. And that is also our right to get answer to every. So they would say like, just look at our privacy policy. So that was, yeah, so I think that then the reason they were not able to give a good response was just because they automated it, and they kind of took control almost over this process of data access. Then I think some companies that were not from the US and EU sometimes did not even pretend they were compliant with the GDPR, because that's what we're talking about, the General Data Protection Act that gives us these data rights. So they didn't even pretend, they were just, yeah, I think many companies were not, we were often also, I noticed that the customer service was held responsible for responding to this request. And I noticed that some people we interacted with were not trained to answer these responses, and they were a bit confused. And sometimes we were saying like, okay, maybe you should consult your technical department or legal department. Maybe they know how to respond to this request, to kind of hand-holding them. Then I think also some other smaller companies, even in the EU, also didn't have the resources. They didn't have, yeah, like it's similar. They didn't have like trained staff to respond to these requests. I think many companies don't care. And I think that's an indicator. This is what I expect. I don't know it's for sure, but I think these companies don't receive a lot of requests, and they're also not monitored by data protection authorities. So they don't have an incentive to comply.
Okay, well, I was triggered by they don't care, or is it also they're not aware they have an obligation?
Yeah, that's something I don't know. I asked some companies also as a follow-up, like why are not able to respond. I think they might say, if I would ask them in person, like, oh, we're not aware. But I mean, 2 things about that. Many of these companies have a privacy policy, most companies, where they mention these data rights. So if you mention it in your privacy policy, you should at some point, I don't have a certain system, organizational process that's also, I don't know, allows customers to make these requests. Secondly, I think, maybe you're not from the GDPR jurisdiction, you're not based in the EU or the UK, but if you're going to offer products or services in this area, you should also comply to certain other rules, such as tax rules, for example. So why wouldn't you comply to tax rules, but you would comply to, I'm not saying that all these companies are very compliant with tax rules, but in theory, there are some laws, national laws.
I get your point. I'm just trying to figure out, is this malicious compliance and non-compliance, in the sense that they are fully aware they're holding back information they should be sharing with you, and do they have something to hide? That's one side of the spectrum. The other is just being completely oblivious and ignorant and saying, no, I'm just ticking the boxes in the sense, oh yeah, I need to put this on my website, privacy statements, security statements, and I don't really understand why I'm putting it there. I'm putting it there anyway. And then when somebody does, like yourself, come back and say, hey, I want to put this into practice, then you're confronted with, actually, I'm not aware why we should be doing this.
Yeah.
So I'd like to figure out if you have an idea of what the consequences are that you're not getting the reply you should be getting.
The consequences. Well, I think first to start with you're sketching two scenarios, and I think it's both true, and it depends really on the company. Some are, well, malicious, some are just don't want to share it. Like, why would they? It's also a competitive disadvantage if you're sharing some kind of data. Secondly, it can also be that they're not aware, not competent. It can all be the case. I think the consequences are, I think that brings in the issue of transparency and accountability there, because it's actually, it's about our data. It's data derived from our bodies. If you talk about fitness trackers, it can be very intimate data from security cameras in our homes. It's our data. I mean, kind of trust these systems, these technologies that will be okay. But in order to have trustworthiness, you need some degree of transparency, and these data rights, especially the right of access and the right of data portability, are there to create as a tool to create transparency for data subjects, for consumers. So if companies are not aware, not compliant, or malicious, whatever reason, they're not able to provide that transparency, it's also hard to trust these technologies and to trust companies. And there's an accountability. They're not taking responsibility they should take for dealing with your quite intimate personal data. And I'm not saying that these companies are selling all that data, or that they are, I don't know, that their employees are looking into your living room all the time. I'm not saying that, but in order to have that trust that that's not happening, you need this accountability, this degree of transparency.
Transparency, yes. Okay, so current status is we don't know yet what companies are doing with the data because we're not getting the feedback. So what's the next step in your research? What's the consequence of this observation?
The consequence is, like I said, it's very hard. I would really like, with my research, I would really like to look into like this data lineage. So we saw that we also, maybe it's interesting to tell this, we also, with the data flow monitoring, we also found interesting observations. We found that we monitored the peaks in data flows. We visualized that while we were interacting with the device. So for example, we would add data to an app and then see, is there a peak in data flow to external servers, or we would show our face in front of a camera or a hand, or use our voice, and then we would observe sometimes that there are like significant peaks in data flows, which suggests that it could be that sensor data is being shared at that time. They're in like real time to external servers. So then we also looked at all the IP addresses that were recipient of these data flows and in which countries these were located. And we found that the data is sent all over the world to lots of, like, also outside of the EU and the UK. And there was like a child smartwatch that sent data to the US and to Russia and Israel. And there were lots of devices that sent data all over the world. We could also identify some companies. We saw that like big cloud providers such as Amazon, Alibaba, Google, Microsoft, they were very prominent players in this kind of ecosystems behind the IoT. So we saw that the data is going everywhere. We don't know what data is going where exactly, but I kind of lost your question. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, well, you triggered me with your reply that the data is going everywhere. Now, could this be as a result of the cloud architecture of that organization, that their cloud is not in one place, but all over the place, which some cloud architectures has? Is that a simple answer? Because the other answer is that if you say, okay, it's in Russia, in Israel, in China, whatever, then you're raising quite a concern if that is the observation, because why is that happening?
Yeah, I think, like, I don't want to claim that some countries are more dangerous than other countries, but I do want to claim that if it's not processed in the jurisdiction of the, if it's, yeah, that within the EU and the UK, there are quite high data protection standards compared to the rest of the world, and also who has access to the data. And in other countries, it's different. And that's, like, I'm not saying that in these other countries' data, people are spying on us. I'm not saying that, but it's just, again, like this issue of insecurity, lack of transparency, lack of trust. Yeah.
Okay, so but what I hear you saying in your research on consumer IoT devices, the data is being shared much more than you would expect.
Yeah.
The data is being shared in places around the world which you would not expect, and we're not getting I would say the required feedback from the vendors when you do ask a question, what's my data? So there's that lack of transparency. So what your research is telling me is, Liz, this needs to be investigated and to assess, hey, what's happening with all these IoT devices, and how can we make certain that they become so transparent that the providers, the vendors, actually adhere to, you could say, the legal requirements.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we need, and I think therefore it would be useful if more consumers would be aware of their rights and send more requests. So I think you suggested that kind of implicitly before. So companies would receive more requests, and then they have an incentive to be more compliant. I think also we have these data protection authorities in countries. They need to monitor these companies more carefully. Also, what I noticed is that I'm not saying that these companies are doing bad, but some companies that are more in the spotlight because they're very large players in this field are a little bit more compliant. I'm not saying I was very happy with the degree of compliance because they were also kind of very generic. And also seeing a very detailed overview of your personal data can also be shocking. For example, we had like voice assistants that the company of the voice assistants shared all the audio fragments of all commands you gave this voice assistant and the transcriptions thereof. I don't know what they're doing with the data, but they could use that, for example, to change these large language models, like ChatGPT, because there's a lot of training data for I don't know, speech recognition. And it's just, I don't know what they're doing with it. That's still, that's not transparent, but yeah, so.
Okay, case in point, you've proven this needs to be addressed. Because at the moment, let's not assume the positive. Let's assume that some of the, you could say, privacy laws we put in place are not being adhered to. So we need to then think about, okay, the governance structure to make certain these devices, these vendors of these IoT devices do, you could say, deliver what they should be doing.
Yeah.
So that's my conclusion.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's also something we discuss. You're right that there should be more oversight. Some people say, oh, we need systems for consumers to empower consumers to take more control over their personal data. And that was also my way of viewing this as a solution when I started this project. So part of the project was also, we've been working with colleagues from Imperial College, and they developed, they're working with the software to block certain destinations. So you're blocking data flows to destinations that are not necessary for the device to function or operate properly. So we also tried that, but then we're also discussing in the report that it's kind of unfair that we already have these data, like you're saying, like we already have these policies, these regulations, we have these data protection principles such as data minimization, purpose limitation, transparency, and it's kind of unfair that when companies, IoT vendors fail to be compliant with these principles and these regulations, that we as consumers should carry the burden and be like super technical with our Raspberry Pis, kind of blocking data flows, adjusting the firmware. That's not...
No, and that's not up to the consumer to do that.
No, so I agree. It's just to make this point that we also, yeah,
okay. Great. Okay. Now, lack of transparency, there's a nice segue to a question I have. Is your research transparent, i.e. can we find it and share it online? So people who are now curious and interested on this discussion can access to in more detail what you've researched so far?
Yes, so I forgot to mention, but this research project that I did so far was funded by the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the UK Data Protection Authority. You can find it on the website of the Information Commissioner's Officer, but we also made our own web page. It's called IoT-transparency.org. Maybe you can add a link somewhere.
We will, yes.
It's free, everyone can download it, everyone can read it. My email address is there, so you can contact me. And yeah, if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking you're an expert in this field, I'm also looking for people to interview to get a better understanding of this, of the attitude of companies, but also from experts in other domains of what's really happening with the data and how we should approach that. So because I'm at the end of the first year of my PhD and I'm still research ongoing.
Well, that's also one of the good things about the Institute for Accountability in Digital Age is facilitate those connections to be made. So we'll definitely make certain that your request for connections and introductions will be forwarded. So I.4ADA, I want to thank you so much for sharing your time and to take us along. Okay, what are the current risks around the Internet of Things? The fact that we do not know what's being done with the data, which is being shared and produced by the Internet of Things devices, and that requires further research to dig into, because without the transparency where it goes to, we have an accountability issue. And you made it very clear, so I want to thank you very much for sharing that with us.
Thank you, Frits.